Well, let me say I'm honored and delighted to have been asked to give this talk as part of the event celebrating the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Theosophical Society, which took place in New York in 1875. And here's where it happened in Irving Place on the east side of New York. It's an area I knew myself when I lived in New York in the late 70s and early 80s. And there actually was a rock club there called the Irving Plaza that I played in. And I don't think the people running the club knew about Madame Blavatsky or the Theosophical Society, but in a way, it just sounds appropriate that there would be a rock club in the same sort of neighborhood. Here's Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott, and of course, William Judge was on hand and several other people at the time of the founding. And this is, I feel like, as they say here in the UK, I feel like I'm bringing coals to Newcastle, which is the equivalent of selling refrigerators to Eskimos, but we used to say when I was a kid in the States. But here, as I'm sure you all know, here's the symbol later devised of the Theosophical Society. And it seems to get together as many possible symbols of different spiritual movements and teachings as possible. And that, I think, is one of the great values of the Theosophical Society and Theosophy itself, that it's one of these wonderful syncretic kind of works. It brings together many, many things. And 1875, though, is a year that's very important in what we might call the esoteric history. Not only is it the year of the founding of the Theosophical Society, it's also the year of the death of the great 19th century French occultist Eliphas Lévy. If you know his works, Transcendental Magic, The History of Magic, and a variety of works in Kabbalah and Tarot, and others, he popularized this whole notion of occultism as a unified system of knowledge. He brought together a variety of things. He's probably most well known these days for his inspired sort of mistake in the sense that he associated the 22 trumps of the tarot with the 22 pads on the tree of life, the Kabbalistic tree of life, and thereby fusing a relationship between the tarot and Kabbalah, which purist historians say it doesn't really exist, that there's no relationship between the Kabbalah and the tarot. But it's one of these inspired syncretic moments when things are brought together, and Lévy was one of the persons to do that. And what's important in the context of Madame Blavatsky, let's say, is that she drew on his work quite a bit in Isis Unveiled. Lévy popularized the notion of the astral light, and he himself developed that from Franz Anton Mesmer's animal magnetism. And he transformed Mesmer's sort of animal magnetism, which was actually a kind of fluid. Mesmer believed it was sort of a physical kind of fluid that could be detected in some ways. And Lévy turned that into something more imaginative. Not imaginary, but something more to do with the magician's mind and mental powers and imagination. And Madame Blavatsky took the astral light, and in books like Isis Unveiled, she more or less transformed that into the Akashic record. So the astral light is this kind of film, imaginative magnetic film, upon which the whole history of mankind and the cosmos is written. And this is something Madame Blavatsky said that she could read. And another interesting item in the esoteric history in the year 1875, it's the birth of the notorious dark magician Aleister Crowley. And Crowley was not a theosophist, but he claimed to have been a reincarnation of Lévy. Among many, many reincarnations that he claimed to have been in past lives. But he did have quite a bit to say about Blavatsky, Crowley. None of it particularly good, but the fact that he felt that he had to make these comments in the first place suggests that she was an important figure to contend with. And if I can leap ahead from 1875 to our own year, 2025, 2025 is the 100th anniversary of the death of Rudolf Steiner, who passed into the life between death and rebirth, as he calls it, in 1925. And Steiner, as I'm sure you probably know, started out as a theosophist before leaving in 1912, around there, to start his own movement, his own spiritual teaching called anthroposophy. But if you're familiar with Steiner's work, it's clear that a great deal of it is rooted in sort of the cosmic evolution, this kind of scheme that Madame Blavatsky presented in her massive work, The Secret Doctrine, And I could add parenthetically that Crowley didn't have a good word about Steiner either. And although Steiner never met Madame Blavatsky, he gave what I consider a simultaneously understated and colorful description of her. Steiner called her a cheeky creature, and she was a bit of a scamp. And he likened her to an electrically charged Leyden jar, which is this device in the 19th century that gave off lots of sparks. So Madame Blavatsky was a cheeky creature who gave up sparks, and that seems to be a good summing up of her character. Personally, I'm not a theosophist, nor a theosophical scholar. I don't belong to any particular school, any organization, church, society of any kind, and I guess I'm an independent seeker of wisdom. And I look for it many places, and I find it in often I find in places where I least expected to find it. But I have written a biography of Madame Blavatsky, and I have given many talks about her for branches of the Theosophical Society in the United States, as I am doing now, but also in the United Kingdom and for audiences outside the theosophical world. So I have some familiarity with my subject. As you can see, my biography of Madame Blavatsky is subtitled The Mother of Modern Spirituality. Now, what do I mean by modern spirituality? Well, you can get some idea of that here. You just take a gander at all these variety of different sorts of things here. And I'd characterize it by talking about it's a grassroots desire for an immediate, direct knowledge and experience of spiritual reality and a more profound relationship with the cosmos than either traditional religion and mainstream science can provide. And I think this was true in Blavatsky's days, and it's even more true today because of her and because of the Theosophical Society's effect. And I would say that if we want to have one very clear, concrete way in which Theosophy, in the form that Madame Blavatsky and some of its later exponents presented it, I would say it was in this inspiration and influence in initiating a widespread grassroots desire for more meaningful understanding of what spirituality is. And today, I say a century and a half since Theosophical Society first began, many of the aims and interests of the early theosophists, which seem strange and eccentric, if not outright bizarre, are now part of our daily lives and language. So what were once strange, eccentric practices are now part of our everyday life. And I would say the Theosophical Society and Theosophy and its exponents were responsible for that. And you don't need to be a theosophist or a devotee of the New Age in order to recognize this. Meditation, once considered an exotic practice, is now commonplace in the business world. It pays. It's something that makes money. So once something makes money, once we know that it's effective in that world, we know it must be real in some way. And its positive effect on creativity and production is widely recognized and advised. And one needn't be a Buddhist or a Hindu to think about karma and how the consequences of one's actions will affect oneself and others. I mean, people with the slightest awareness of theosophy, if any at all, will talk about bad karma in their everyday conversations. And vegetarianism, which is a staple of theosophic practice and once a very, very strange dietary regimen, is now not only popular, but in many cases, it's become the main eating habit of millions of people who might otherwise have been unreflecting carnivores. So this is some very basic, fundamental ways I think in which Theosophy has changed the world. Every day, if something changes our everyday habits of life, it's had a major change on how we live, whether we want to recognize it kind of explicitly or not. It's just there. But I would say we can move on from these very, very broad kind of developments into something a bit more specific. And I would say, our fascination with ancient civilizations, with Egypt, the Sphinx, the pyramids, the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayan, and even earlier possible civilizations like Atlantis and Lemuria, and all of this stuff it fills the pages of like many, many scientific and woo-woo books about all of this and provides material for numerous History Channel style sort of documentaries. I would say all of this emerged out of Theosophy and Theosophical sort of mission statement to study the ancient religions and sciences and philosophies of the ancient world. And then once you've opened up that door, many things can come in. There's interest in reincarnation, past lives, the aura, secret teachings, ascended masters, astral travel, near-death experiences, higher consciousness, and much else that we can find at many metaphysical bookshops that sprouted up in the 1970s and is still popular today. And here's one that I worked at. It started in the early 1970s, the Bodhi Tree bookshop in Los Angeles. It's not there anymore. I think it closed in 2012. I worked there in the late 80s and into the early 90s. And it was one of these places that it was absolutely a center for spiritual thought. And it was very popular. And I'll get on to one of the reasons why it was popular is this actress here, Shirley MacLaine. But even earlier than Shirley MacLaine's interest in past lives and auras and all of that, which led to a book and then a mini series, and then actually many people becoming interested in this. In 1970, the best-selling novelist Kurt Vonnegut, he wrote an article for McCall's magazine claiming that Madame Blavatsky was the founding mother of the occult in America. So this was at the 1970s, sort of the tail end of the 1960s, which in one of my early books called Turn Off Your Mind, I write about what's called the occult revival in the 1960s. How in the 1960s, ideas about the occult, magic, mysticism, spirituality became very popular. And probably the one central sign of how popular all of that stuff was in the 60s was the Beatles album, Sgt. Pepper's, came out in 1967. And on the cover of that, Aleister Crowley, who I turned up earlier, was on that, along with C.G. Jung, Aldous Huxley, and various other sort of people associated with spirituality. So the most famous people in the world in the mid-1960s were interested in all this sort of stuff. But, Blavatsky might have remarked flapdoodle about her being the mother of anything, whether it's the occult or modern spirituality in my book. But the thing about Vonnegut's article is that it spelled out the enormous influence that Blavatsky had and Theosophy had on the 60s counterculture. And we can even say, that what we understood in the 1960s, or if you were around then, as I was a kid, and, people today look back and see as this free love, back to nature, do your own thing, all that kind of sensibility of currency. Well, that we could say that sort of started in the late 19th century in Switzerland, in a place called Ascona, and this was one of the earliest, if not the earliest, kind of back to nature health food communes. Started up there. Today, Ascona is a very upmarket tourist resort sort of area, but there's still a museum there dedicated to what was known as Monte Verita, the Mountain of Truth. And this was originally started by a group of Theosophists and in 1889, and one of them was Countess Constance Wachmeister. If you know Madame Blavatsky's life, she was Madame Blavatsky's traveling companion in her last days and devoted follower. And so a group of Theosophists then in 1889, they started up this sort of counterculture commune in this area in Ascona. And people like Hermann Hesse, the very popular in the 1960s and 70s, still read today, German-Swiss novelist, and Isadora Duncan, the dancer, Rudolf Laban, the choreographer, Rudolf Steiner, mentioned earlier, the novelist D.H. Lawrence, who was apparently a fan of Madame Blavatsky's work. These and many other people, famous people at the time, who frequented this counterculture commune in Ascona. So, and as I said earlier before, when I was working at this bookshop in around 1987, this was when this actress Shirley MacLaine, if you're of a certain age, you'll remember her from movies in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. She got very interested in her past lives and auras and reincarnation and a variety of different things, crystals and all that sort of stuff. And she wrote this book out on the limb about it. Then it became a mini series on television. And once that happened, it sort of put the New Age on the map. And the bookstore I was working at, its clientele trebled after that TV miniseries. And actually got quite a few people from sort of the Hollywood community coming in. So that was like the widely popular, what we might say, kind of sociological impact of ideas that were fundamentally rooted, I would say, in Theosophy and in the Theosophical Society tradition. But if we stay in that world, the esoteric world, sort of narrowcast uh, the influence that Theosophy had and Theosophical Society had. It certainly had enormous influence on what we would call the esoteric world and the milieu, and a variety of different esoteric teachers that are still popular today. I mean, I've already mentioned Steiner, whose work goes out into education and agriculture and architecture and art and theater and a variety of other very hands-on practical kind of efforts. But someone else who is also uh, early in his career was a very influential theosophist was P.D. Ouspensky, who's a Russian. He was a compatriot of Madame Blavatsky. And he's best known, sadly, I think, because he was an important writer and thinker, a brilliant philosopher in his own right, but he's best known as an exponent of the work of G.I. Gurdjieff. But as I said, Ouspensky in St. Petersburg and Moscow in the early 20th century, he was a very well-known theosophist giving lectures. He wrote about the fourth dimension. He wrote about the tarot. He wrote about higher consciousness and a variety of different things. And he liked to tell the story that when he went on what was called his Search for the Miraculous, his subsequent book about his time with Gurdjieff was called that. But initially, Ouspensky believed that there were still schools somewhere in the East where one could learn how to achieve these different states of consciousness that he was exploring on his own in different ways, but he thought there were places, there were actual schools where, in the sense that Madame Blavatsky, she was taught how to master her higher states of consciousness by, Kuthumi and Master Moria in Tibet. And so Ouspensky thought there must be schools where this can still take place. And so he went on this journey, this search of the miraculous. It took him to Egypt, it took him to Turkey, it took him to Ceylon, India. And he liked to tell the story that when he was in India, he visited the headquarters of the Theosophical Society in Adyar. And he said it was a three-storied building. And the ground floor was that was where the rank and file members congregated. And the second floor was the space put aside for the wealthy patrons. But the third floor, the top floor, was reserved for the most prestigious guests. And Ouspensky liked to tell the story that when he arrived there, he was immediately taken up to the top floor, and he was introduced to Annie Besant, who was there at the time. And I mentioned Gurdjieff, who's over here. He was not a theosophist, but he certainly was aware of Madame Blavatsky's work. And if you're aware of Gurdjieff's work and Madame Blavatsky's work and both their lives, there are many echoes, there are many kind of similarities between the two. And Gurdjieff was certainly influenced in writing his huge work, if you know Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. It's one of those, gigantic kind of works that is very, very difficult to get through, because it's either Gurdjieff was a bad writer or he purposely wrote it in such a way that you really had to work at it to get to the nugget of what the meaning was. But I've read that, and I've read Secret Doctrine, and there's many, and Isis Unveiled, and there's many similarities where he would not give Madame Blavatsky credit for it, but he takes a kind of feather from her cap, as it were, and develops ideas that she develops there. And also in his much more readable and shorter book, Meetings with Remarkable Men, which is about his early years, in search of hidden wisdom, in search of the unknown, in much the same way Madame Blavatsky went in search of it. And he talks about his similar sort of seeking with a group of others like himself called the Seekers of Truth. And Madame Blavatsky talked about a group of people that she knew, and she referred to them in a similar kind of way. So here's one group of many where Blavatsky and Theosophical influence was carried on by other figures in the esoteric world. But we could move on. I'm just going to give a few more here. I mean, one obvious one is Jiddu Krishnamurti, who, after his time in the society, went on to become a respected and much loved teacher of his own. Another Russian compatriot, Madame Blavatsky, was the painter, explorer, and mystic Nicholas Roerich, who inspired and provided the sets for Igor Stravinsky's groundbreaking modern ballet, The Rite of Spring, which scandalized Paris in its debut in 1913. He was also a theosophist. In the 1920s and 30s, Roerich's standing as a spiritual teacher was immense, and he hobnobbed with presidents and other famous figures in the world at the time, people like H.G. Wells and Bernard Shaw. He's famous today, or known today, for the Roerich Peace Plan. It was a doctrine he developed in the 30s to preserve works of art and works of cultural importance during times of war so that they wouldn't be destroyed. And this was signed by Roosevelt, president at the time, and many other important figures. And it was sort of recognized by the United Nations and things of that sort. So again, a theosophist who's up there in the world, very practical work with politicians and statesmen. And another figure who not as well known or as influential, let's say, as Roerich was in an obvious way, but in his own way, a very important esoteric writer and philosopher is the maverick Egyptologist and alchemist Rene Schwaller de Lubitsch. And among other things, Schwaller de Lubitsch started as theosophist. But among other things, he was the one who sort of pointed out that the erosion marks on the Sphinx are made by water, not by sand, not by wind-blown sand. And for water to have, for there been enough water to cause erosion marks on the Sphinx, the stone that it's made out of, that must have been at a time when there was heavy rainfall in Egypt, which would have been thousands and thousands and thousands of years earlier than the official recognized date of when the Sphinx was made. So he dated the Sphinx back to about 10,000 years earlier than the official account. And this led to a whole genre of kind of ancient mysteries popular literature. And I don't know in the States so much, but here in the UK, there's a fellow named Graham Hancock, and he's written quite a few bestsellers based on this. But again, I think it's the sort of thing where Theosophy is looking back to these ancient civilizations, whether it's in Egypt, whether it's Atlantis or the Lemuria, but somehow something older and before our own contemporary time. And I could go on with this list of different important esoteric figures who have been influenced by Theosophy and Theosophy's effect on them. But I'll just do one more, and probably the most impressive figure from the literary world among the early Theosophists. And again, I should say there's many literary figures who were influenced by Theosophy. I don't have time to bring them all in here. But W.B. Yeats, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1923, little more than a century ago. He came into contact with Theosophy in Dublin, in Ireland, when he met Theosophist Mohini Chatterjee, who was traveling with Madame Blavatsky on her visit to London, 1884, from India. And Mohini Chatterjee came over to Dublin and visited the Dublin Theosophical Society. And Yeats joined the Dublin Theosophical Society then. And a few years later, 1887, he moved to London, and Madame Blavatsky was living there. She had arrived there after her sort of wandering years in Europe, after having to leave India because of the scandal, because of the so-called, debunking of the masters and the scandal around the letters from the Columns who claimed that the masters are all fakes and all this sort of stuff. And so rather than what she wanted to do, she wanted to defend herself in court against this. But if I remember correctly, Colonel Olcott said, well, this would mean you would have to produce the masters. You would have to sort of say who the masters were. And this was something that Blavatsky refused to do because she had taken a vow not to reveal their identities and all of that. So she took the way of blame. which is a way that she even talks about a kind of spiritual way where you take on the calumny of the world and you don't fight against it. And so she left India, and her wandering years in Europe, eventually she wound up on these shores here in London. Actually, I live not too far from where she spent her last days, in Annie Besant's house. And in the years she was here, among the many people she met was Yeats. And Yeats called her the most human person alive, and he compared her to an old Irish peasant woman. But he said she was a woman of great warmth and great humor. And he told the story of her sitting in front of this kind of card table. It has like green baize. Baize is this material. It's on a pool table. So when you click the billiards or the pool balls, they roll smoothly. But Madame Blavatsky would be rolling her cigarettes all the time and then writing sort of occult symbols with chalk on this table, and all the time playing solitaire or patience, I think it was called over here, but the card game by yourself. And she would play this game. And my understanding, I say this in my book about her, where I think she was, in doing that, she was occupying what today I would say her left brain, let's say, or her everyday personality. And that while that was occupied, this other side of herself could come out, and it would come out in some strange ways. But after a while, Yeats was actually asked to leave the Theosophical Society because he was very interested in actually experimenting, occult experiments. He wanted to somehow have some kind of physical proof of different occult ideas, manifestations of things of that sort, magical practices. He practiced ceremonial magic, and Madame Blavatsky abhorred ceremonial magic. She thought it was a decadent kind of practice. So he was basically asked to leave. And he went and he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which we say here is the Hermetic offspring of Theosophy. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is the most famous secret society of the late 19th, early 20th century. Yeats was a member in it. Aleister Crowley was famously a member, and his joining it led to its fracturing. But one of the founders of it was William Westcott, who was a theosophist, and he was a member of Madame Blavatsky's inner circle, her esoteric order. So this was the inner sanctum of her students, where she would teach, the very special, very esoteric interpretations of theosophical ideas. And he's one of the founders of the Hermetic Order of Golden Dawn, and that is enormously influenced on modern magic. And if anybody who's interested in this, if you mention Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, so yeah, they know exactly, and they'll reel off all the different members and all that sort of thing. But another fellow who was part of Madame Blavatsky's inner order, esoteric order, was John Watkins. And he went on to start Watkins Bookshop, which is the oldest occult or metaphysical bookshop in London. I go there often. In fact, in February, I'll be there signing books for a new book I have out. So again, here's some concrete, very visible ways in which Theosophy has changed the world and added to the world something that, let's say, wasn't there before. So now it shouldn't surprise us that Theosophy would affect esoteric ideas and esoteric practice and things of that sort. I mean, musicians have an impact on music, artists have an impact on art, and writers have an impact on writing. But I would say it's Theosophy's influences went beyond that. It spread beyond that. I've already shown how it spread beyond that in our everyday life with, our eating habits and talking about karma and meditating and things of that sort. But as I sort of thought about this talk and the idea of like, well, how did Theosophy change the world? I came to see, at least for me, several ways or a few ways in which it was even broader than what I've said, or even ways in which we might not consider Theosophy to have any kind of impact. And I think there's evidence to suggest that in some ways, Madame Blavatsky was a co-creator of the modern age, in the same way that Darwin, Marx, and Freud are considered sort of the co-creators of a modern age. And one of the people who mentioned this was the late esoteric scholar Christopher Bamford. And I remember him saying that to me. He thought Madame Blavatsky had as much influence on our modern world as these gentlemen have, and you usually wouldn't see her. You wouldn't see a woman in the first place, probably, among this august company. But you certainly wouldn't have seen Madame Blavatsky in it. So what I'm going to do next is sort of go into some very specific ways, I would say, concrete ways in which Theosophy has changed the world. But before I do that, let me kind of give the historical context in which Theosophy arrived, because I think it when it arrived in 1875 in New York, 150 years ago, it turned up at the right time. Now, Blavatsky tells us she was sent to the West to fulfill a mission, and part of the fulfillment of that mission was the founding of the Theosophical Society. Now, what was the mission? As far as I understand it, the mission was to stop the spread of materialism. Now, by materialism, at that time, we weren't. It wasn't consumerism that we associate with our early 21st century culture of sort of nonstop shopping. Although that itself is an outgrowth of this a broader materialism that Blavatsky was sent to the West by the masters to slow down its progress and to stop it if possible. But it was what we call scientific materialism, and in different ways, all three of these. Although Darwin actually was a Christian, and he became quite concerned about how his ideas were being interpreted towards the end of his life, in the sense of showing no need for any kind of mind at work, no need for any kind of purpose at work in the origin of life. It's just chance, chance mutations on organic matter, and just one thing led to the other, and molecules started lining up, and then suddenly there's us. There's no reason behind it. There's no purpose. There's no meaning or anything like that. But Darwin was actually quite concerned that his ideas were being interpreted in that way. But Marx was an out-and-out materialist, and so was Freud. And the idea behind that is like anything other than that, like mind or soul or spirit. It's really at bottom material, if it exists in any way at all. And when Theosophy emerged in the late 19th century, this would have been still a very challenging, disturbing kind of idea, doctrine. I mean, nowadays people just accept it without a blink of the eye. Most people don't kind of explicitly advocate it, but I think the general assessment is like, well, this is what science says, so it must be true. And again, what this amounts to is that everything in the universe, ourselves included, is a result of just chance action of matter. There's no reason for it. There's no meaning to it. We're accidental result of a purposeless kind of universe. And as I say, we don't really grasp that. We kind of just, it's sort of the whatever generation. Oh, well, that's the case. Who cares? We have people telling us that all the time, that we're nothing but machines in some way, or zombies or something. And there's no soul, there's no spirit, there's nothing like that. And, scientists have explained everything, and so on. And, we just have to stop worrying about things like the soul, because they don't really exist. But one of the other things, if that wasn't bad enough, it wasn't bad enough being told that we're trousered apes, which was the phrase, that we're descended from apes, and the apes themselves descended from some chance patch of molecules that turned into what we call life. If that wasn't bad enough, in 1865, so 10 years before the founding of the Theosophical Society, a German physicist named Rudolf Clausius developed what has become known as the second law of thermodynamics, or in its short form, entropy. And it's the process by which organized energy becomes unorganized. So you have a cup of hot coffee, and you leave it in the room, and 10 minutes later, it's not as hot as it was. And 20 minutes later, it's lukewarm. And if you leave it long enough, it wouldn't necessarily get cold, it gets room temperature. So what happens is organized energy flattens out to the average. And it does seem to be an inescapable part of the reality of the cosmos, that all of the organized energy in the cosmos will eventually flatten out to a kind of lukewarm cosmic puddle. And this was what was known as the heat death of the universe. That eventually might be billions of years down the line, but eventually the sun will burn out and every other star will burn out, and there'll just be a kind of flat, lukewarm cup of coffee throughout the whole cosmos. And it's strange that emerged from the very science that at the same time was enabling human beings in the Western developed world, at least in the Industrial Revolution, to have enormous power and control over matter. We were able to manipulate the world. We were able to become dominant on it because of our control of scientific knowledge over how matter works, and so on and so on. But the very knowledge that gave us this power also led to this understanding that in the end, there's no point to it because it's all going to flatten out into a lukewarm cup of coffee. And if you know your English literature, this is expressed in poetry in a famous poem by Matthew Arnold called Dover Beach, and where he talks about ignorant armies clashing by night on a darkling plain, and this whole idea that it's all chaos, it's all pointless. There's another poem around the same time by Alfred Lord Tennyson called The Kraken, which is the Scandinavian sea monster. And the poem tells the story of how the Kraken at the bottom of the ocean floor suddenly wakes up and rises to the surface and pierces the surface and is up in the daylight and all that, and then he basically just dies and sinks back down. So there's a kind of pointlessness to all of this kind of energy. So at the same time, you have all these ideas of progress and infinite development, and all of that. There's a sense of futility starts to come in. And one of the people who was an early critic of Darwinian ideas about evolution, about it being a mindless, process, pure chance, an accident, was Samuel Butler, who's known for his book Erewhon, this kind of utopian fantasy, and also a book called The Way of All Flesh. But he wrote a series of books in the late 1880s, or 1870s into the early 1880s, critical of Darwin. But actually, Madame Blavatsky's criticism in Isis Unveiled predates his. Isis Unveiled came out in 1877. Butler's book Life and Habit came out in 1878. And he usually gets the credit for being the first scientific or philosophical criticism of Darwinian evolution, not religious. It was criticized by the religious thinkers from the beginning, but this was like actually taking the idea seriously and not just dismissing it and understanding it and seeing where there's problems and all that. But Blavatsky, her idea, she says, well, this notion of a heat death of the universe and this very limited idea of evolution, what's wrong with it is that it leaves out what happened before and what happens after. And the vision of this kind of vast, cycle of cosmic birth, death, and rebirth that she presents in her work. The days and nights of Brahma, the Manvantaras and Pralayas. And within this incalculable cosmic kind of play, Theosophy taught that our souls evolve through this remarkable kind of journey, through every kind of condition of existence in the cosmos until eventually our souls arrive with the unity of with the spirit that's behind all of it. So again, this is where Blavatsky isn't just rejecting Darwinian evolution or rejecting the science of the time, the physics of the time, but she's putting it in a context that's much bigger than that picture, and it gives a positive image. So at a time when the leading minds were saying life is meaningless, and even today we still get that. I mean, if you ever see any of these science kind of documentaries talking about the mysteries and wonders of the cosmos and all that, what they leave out is that and anybody working in mainstream sort of astrophysics and all that, there's a fellow here named Brian Cox who's a young guy. He does a lot of popular sort of science documentaries, and he says stuff like, human beings occupy a small island of meaning in a vast, cosmos of meaninglessness. So this is still the same idea. There's, when you look up at the night sky, the stars and the vastness, it's all just an accident. There's nothing, there's no purpose behind it. There's no mind behind it. It's the same idea. Blavatsky fought that idea then when it was first establishing itself. It's still 150 years later, it's still the dominant idea, although the opposition to it has grown considerably. And I would say because of Theosophy's influence and Madame Blavatsky's influence. So you have a positive, optimistic kind of view emerging at a time when the mainstream scientific view is telling us that it's, all pointless. It's completely meaningless and all that. Okay, so having established a very broad canvas on which, as I say, Theosophy has changed the world or added to it in ways that have enriched and changed our life. I'm going to focus on what I think are three, let's say, concrete ways, which we might not usually think of it as. And the first one I was going to say is politics. I don't know of a particular political program with Theosophy at Theosophical Society. I know Madame Blavatsky talked about her great-grandfather or great-uncle, excuse me, I forget which it was right now, who was a Mason in Russia in the 18th century. And it talks about this plan for a reorganization of the map of Europe. And this leads back into a variety of different so-called Masonic ideas or conspiracies or plots, the Illuminati, and a variety of all sorts of things to sort of, initiate a more progressive, I would say, kind of political and social world in Europe at the time. And this is why I always say, Madame Blavatsky always strikes me as a free-thinking humanist more than anything else. That's what she strikes me as, a 19th century free-thinking humanist. And she usually gets tarred with this other brush, somehow right-wing or, racist or even fascist or something like that. And she's the complete opposite of all of that. I'm not going into detail here. I talk about that in my book. But that's the one context in which I understand some sort of political context. But this is sort of, the Masonic aim to initiate a brotherhood of man. So not like political parties and things of that sort. So political, social. But Theosophy did have an enormous impact on the politics of at least one nation, India. And this happened, or the start of this was when Madame Blavatsky was in London around the time when Yeats met her. Someone else who met her, who doesn't get mentioned that much in this context, was Mohandas Gandhi. And my joke is that Gandhi was in London studying to be Ben Kingsley. If you remember the movie from some years ago, Kingsley plays him, and the actor Ben Kingsley plays Gandhi, and he's in London studying law. He's being a lawyer, and he's got the bowler hat and the umbrella and all of that he's carrying around all the sort of emblems of sort of British propriety and all that. And the story is that he comes upon, well, two theosophists come upon him. And because of Madame Blavatsky's interest in all things having to do with India and Hindu and all of that, they're just happy to meet anyone, anyone who comes from India. And they start talking with him, and they say to him, like, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if all of us could read the Bhagavad Gita, which is, I'm sure you know, this wonderful work of spiritual wisdom in the Hindu tradition, if we could read this all in the original language. And Gandhi had to admit that he had never read it in any language because the Christian missionaries, when he was growing up, told him it was rubbish. It was nonsense and all that. And so they said, well, you have to meet Madame Blavatsky. And so they hurried him over to where she was. And she introduced him to his own culture. She introduced him to the Bhagavad Gita. She introduced him to other Hindu ideas, ahimsa, in the way of nonviolence. And it became, along with Tolstoy, one of the main influences on his life. You'll always find a mention of Tolstoy, as the great Russian writer, Leo Tolstoy, late 19th century, and his ideas about sort of gospel kind of influence ideas. And Gandhi was very influenced by those, but he was also very influenced by Madame Blavatsky, and she introduced him to his own culture, which is what she did when she was in India anyway, and I'll get into that. In the rest of his life, Gandhi always said, I mean, he joined the Theosophical Society 1891, but he also said that Theosophy was one of the most important influences on him, and he said that Theosophy was Hinduism at its best. And in the journal Harijan, that he wrote and produced. On the day of his assassination, he had written that Theosophy is Hinduism in theory, and Hinduism is Theosophy in practice. And so at the beginning of Gandhi, and then later, as we know, Annie Besant, who became head of the Theosophical Society after Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott, she was integral to Indian Home Rule and the Indian National Congress, and eventually to India's independence from the British Raj. And Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, was initiated in the Theosophical Society by Annie Besant. And by this time, she had suffered arrest, by the British for her pro-Indian activism. And she was later made president of the National Congress. So this is a very, very concrete way in which Theosophy changed the world. And I don't know of any other esoteric school or teaching that had this kind of political impact. Steiner actually had some in post-World War I in Central Europe. He had written something called The Threefold Social Order, and it was a plan to reconstruct Europe after the catastrophe of World War I. And some anthroposophical candidates got onto some local, won in some local elections, but nothing like on the scale of Indian independence being rooted in Gandhi being introduced to the Bhagavad Gita by Madame Blavatsky. So there's one very, very concrete. So we're going to move from concrete to a little less concrete and into the art world. And it was known for some time amongst art dealers and historians, some of the most important figures in the early days of modern abstract or non-representational art were deeply influenced by Theosophy and other esoteric schools. But until relatively recently, this is something that was sort of dismissed, or if it was mentioned at all, it was muted. It hardly ever turned up in analyses or criticisms of different artists' work. It would be something they would recognize. Yes, and much like with Yeats, you really have to know Yeats's interest in Theosophy and in magic and a variety of other esoteric philosophies to get the real meaning of a lot of his poetry. And it wasn't until relatively recently, in the last 40, 50 years, let's say, that literary critics and historians began to take his interest in Theosophy and magic seriously, similarly with these artists. But something happened in 1986 in Los Angeles, and at the LA County Museum of Art. And this was an enormous exhibition called The Spiritual in Art, Abstract Painting, 1890 to 1985. And I had the great good fortune to attend this exhibition, as I lived in Los Angeles at the time. And it was the first major exhibition purposely designed to highlight the enormous influence that esoteric, occult, magical, spiritual ideas had on the evolution of abstract art. And among the many, many, many different philosophies and schools of thought that had influenced many of these artists, Theosophy was one of the most prominent. Probably every major artist dipped into the Theosophical palette, as it were, working on their paintings. Now, the name that usually comes up as the founder or the first abstract artist responsible for the first abstract painter is Vasily Kandinsky, another Russian. And this is generally considered the first abstract painting. It's called his first abstract watercolor. It was 1910. And abstract, it's non-representational. What does it mean? It means it doesn't represent something. So it's not a landscape painting, or it's not a portrait. So it's not a painting of something. It doesn't represent anything. It is something itself. And this was a movement in different areas in music, in art at the same time. I should say music doesn't, that was interesting slip, because music, this doesn't apply to it, because music itself is one of the arts that's not representational to begin with. You can have some pieces of music that are supposed to be sunset or dawn or bird song or something like that, but music itself, it doesn't represent anything. It is something itself. And this, in many ways, this was why the aesthetician William Pater said that all art aspires to the condition of music. And this is what was happening in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, that artists wanted to liberate themselves and the painting to have to be about something. It didn't have to be anything. It was something itself. And Kandinsky became very, very interested in Theosophy, and especially two books called Man Visible and Invisible by C.W. Leadbeater and Thought Forms, which Leadbeater wrote with Annie Besant. Because in those books, they talked about how thoughts were things and that thoughts actually had a certain shape and a certain form. And they gave sort of examples of different meditation practices in which one would be able to sort of see these things, see these thought forms, as it were. And Kandinsky was very interested in that because he had a whole idea that he thought that we were on the threshold of what he called the epoch of the great spiritual. And in his own way, he wanted to fight materialism in the same way that Madame Blavatsky did. And what he thought he was doing or could do with this abstract painting, non-representational painting, is that he was opening up portals into sort of non-spatio-temporal realms, other higher sorts of realms. So in a way, his canvases became portals into sort of the realm that Annie Besant and Leadbeater were exploring with their books and thought forms. And another very famous, important figure in early modern art, Piet Mondrian. He was a theosophist. He was even more sort of related to the Theosophical Society than Kandinsky because he joined it in, I think, 1909, and he remained in it until his death in 1944. And he lived in very different places. He was Dutch. He lived in the Netherlands, but he also lived in France. He lived in the United States. He lived in England. In fact, he lived not too far from where I live in North London. I walked by where there's a little plaque saying Piet Mondrian lived there. But he said that all of his painting, all of his inspiration came from Blavatsky's secret doctrine. And if you know the sort of painting he's most known for, these very highly stylized geometric sorts of things, squares and cubes and things of that sort, which he claims came to him from reading the secret doctrine, and somehow this was his perception of the underlying sort of form of the cosmos, the underlying form of existence. But before he was doing this sort of non-representational, again, painting, he did early representational works, and this very well-known one called Evolution, this was a triptych depicting the development of the soul, the evolution of the soul, based on different theosophical sorts of ideas. He had a sort of stormy relationship with the Theosophical Society in the different places where he joined. Wherever he lived, he found the local branch and he joined it. But they often found his own ideas about art a little too abstract and strange for them. But nonetheless, his work, which is highly recognizable and is deeply steeped in theosophical ideas. Now, in recent times, someone has actually not made the claim themselves, but historians now say that this person is actually responsible for the first non-representational, the first abstract painting. Not Kandinsky. And this was someone whose work was not well known until that groundbreaking exhibition in 1986, The Spiritual in Art, 1890, 1985. And this is Hilma af Klint, and she was a Swedish illustrator, but she was also a theosophist, anthroposophist, a spiritualist, a medium. She worked with several other women in doing these kind of group paintings, which she made a living as an illustrator, and she's very good draftsman. But she did these enormous, here's some of them down here, exhibitions, enormous paintings of either spiritual processes or kind of landscapes of these inner realms that she was mapping out through her reading in Theosophy and Anthroposophy and spiritualism. And she joined the Theosophical Society in 1904. And she was in Sweden, so she would have been coming under sort of the German branch of the society. And this was when Steiner was still the head of it then. And they met, but they eventually had a falling out. But one of the things, I mean, whether she predates Kandinsky with abstract painting or not is, it's a arguable point. But what's important is that the idea that she may have has stimulated a lot of interest in other women painters at a time when it was really a male-dominated kind of art form. And so one of the ideas that feminists have picked up on Hilma and other painters at that time, because they're the sort of the gender bending sort of thing. But Madame Blavatsky was uprooting all that kind of stuff much earlier. As I say, she was this free-thinking humanist and all that. But I always wondered why the feminists didn't grab onto her. But I suspect the whole occult, stain has kept them off and all that. And the last way in which I'm going to look at how Theosophy changed the world is the way of the Bodhisattva. And you might notice that I've gone from very concrete practical politics to less so aesthetic and imaginative with art. And now we're entering completely impractical, let's say, or non-concrete in the spiritual, in the area of religion. And one of the things that upset the British Raj when Madame Blavatsky was in India was when she and Colonel Olcott converted to Buddhism. Which they did it was called Ceylon then. It's Sri Lanka now, in 1880. And this was quite remarkable because you didn't have too many high-profile Westerners celebrating Buddhism and becoming Buddhists. And in fact, Colonel Olcott, I'm sure you know, I mean, he went on to write a Buddhist catechism and for a Buddhist there. So this again. This is a time in India when the Christian missionaries are there, the British Raj are in control. They're trying to convert all the Indians to Christianity. The local people are not being taught their own religion, not being taught their own culture, not being taught their own spirituality, and all of this. And suddenly you have these two Westerners there, an American and a Russian from the other sides of the world there, and they're celebrating the indigenous culture. They're celebrating Indian culture. They're celebrating Buddhism. And they went native in a very, very radical way. And just as Madame Blavatsky would years later basically introduce Gandhi to his own culture, she and Madame and Colonel Olcott were doing that at that time at India. And Blavatsky said, though, her Buddhism was a peculiar sort. It was the kind of esoteric Buddhism, or it's the Buddhism that was behind mainstream Buddhism, but it was also behind Christianity and Judaism and Islam and Hinduism and Zoroastrianism or whatever. So it was this perennial philosophy that you find it in Isis Unveiled, you find it in the Secret Doctrine. So it's the teaching that's behind all the other teachings. And she spelled that out in a large form in the Secret Doctrine, which we know is commentary on the Book of Dzyan, written in the mysterious language of Senzar. But and Madame Blavatsky claimed to have learned Senzar and read the Book of Dzyan in her time in Tibet. Now, in my book on Madame Blavatsky, I look into all the possible evidence for her possibly being in Tibet. And I think the jury's out whether she was there or not. I mean, I give her the benefit of the doubt. But whether she was there or not, she certainly brought some Tibet back to the West. And what I mean by this is that Madame Blavatsky really introduced Mahayana Buddhism to the West, and that's the most popular form of Buddhism, certainly in the West. The Buddhism that was known in the West before that was Theravada, and that's the Buddhism of Southeast Asia. And the Mahayana Buddhists often refer to Theravada in this sort of slightly, what's the word? denigrating way, and they call Theravada the Hinayana. And yana is vehicle, and maha means great. So Mahatma, Atma is soul, so great souls. Hina means small. Yana is a vehicle, so it's a raft, and it's the raft that can take you from the shore of ignorance to the shore of enlightenment across the river, and so on. But the Theravada, it's just the raft is one passenger. They can only take one passenger, and these are the arhats. These are the ones who have fasted and practiced a variety of ascetic exercises and meditated and have done everything they could to free themselves of Maya and samsara, and work and work and work and actually break through samsara, break out of the wheel, and go to nirvana. And but as you know, Blavatsky, she didn't think too highly of these. He thought they were rather selfish. These individuals were just interested in their own salvation and their own enlightenment. And the people who follow this tend to follow the earliest, the Tripitaka, the three baskets, the earliest collection of teachings of the Buddha. But some centuries after the Buddha's death, this wider or more generous idea of Buddhism, the Mahayana, the great vehicle, started up. And this was the notion that no, the idea was not to work diligently on your own salvation, and forget about everybody else. The idea was to follow the way of compassion and to remain in samsara, to remain in this world of nescience and suffering, and to help others reach enlightenment, help others reach liberation too, and to not pass into nirvana until all sentient beings are freed. And this was a message that Madame Blavatsky brought across. And one of the last things she did, The Voice of the Silence, fragments from the Golden Book of Precepts, which is another collection of writings that she came across in Tibet. And it's a much shorter work. It's a more meditative kind of work than Isis Unveiled or Secret Doctrine. But this introduced to the West this Mahayana tradition of the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is someone who could carry on into nirvana, could pass out of the wheel of rebirth and all that, but decides to stay and to help others. And this form of Buddhism was practically unknown in the West until Blavatsky introduced it. And the first sort of generation of Buddhist scholars following the founding of the Theosophical Society were all Theosophists. So you have D.T. Suzuki, who introduced Zen Buddhism to the West in the early 20th century. He claimed that in The Voice of the Silence, he found the real Mahayana Buddhism. Edward Kanza, who's another great Buddhist scholar and translator, he believed that Madame Blavatsky was the reincarnation of Tsongkhapa, who was the 14th century founder of the founder of the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism. And Christmas Humphreys here was the founder of the Buddhist Society, London Buddhist Society, which that's the building there in front of here. He established Buddhism as a popular religion through an influential anthology called The Wisdom of Buddhism, which included selections from The Voice of the Silence. And over here we have Lama Kazi Dawap Samdap, whose translation of the Bardo Thodol was published by W.Y. Evans Wentz as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And he said there was sufficient evidence that Blavatsky was acquainted with the higher teachings of Buddhism that she claimed to be initiated into. So this is sort of circumstantial or veiled kind of confirmation that they believe, yes, that she had been to Tibet. Because where else would she have learned this? Because this material wasn't available at the time. And all of those first, generation Western Buddhists were Theosophists. And today, the millions of Westerners who practice Tibetan Buddhism, which is the most popular form of Buddhism in the West, and revere the Dalai Lama, have Theosophy to thank for this, for making it possible. And the Dalai Lama himself said in The Voice of the Silence, it has strongly influenced many sincere seekers and aspirants to the wisdom and compassion of the Bodhisattva path. And I would say that of all the different ways in which Theosophy has changed the world, that this would be the one that Madame Blavatsky would have approved of wholeheartedly, because this was something that I think, in essence, is what she firmly believed in, very much wanted to effect, to some way spread this notion of the Bodhisattva, of individuals who help other individuals, the way of compassion, into becoming enlightened. So I thank you, and I hope Madame Blavatsky thanks you and me as well. Good evening.